So good afternoon, everyone. I will present a paper that has been published at the end of 2024. That's called Broadening the Scope of Anthropogenic Influence in Extreme Event Attribution. I have presented this, a big part of this at the General Assembly. So if you were there, you might want to skip this one because it's a lot of the same. Here you have the reference to the actual article. And to understand the scope of the paper, I think it's important to highlight that extreme event attribution has been moving more and more towards extreme impact attribution. So the first extreme event attribution studies were about climate variables such as temperature or precipitation, and trying to understand the anthropogenic footprint on those the extremes of temperature or precipitation or other variables that are very closely related to the weather. And as extreme event attribution has grown, we have more and more studies that are doing extreme impact attribution. So, for example, if you have heat wave that causes mortality, trying to evaluate how many more people died because of climate change. Or trying to see how much more damage was made related to a storm because of climate change, and how many more houses were flooded, changes in crop yields, things like that. And the way it's been done in our community has been following this kind of framework where you have the climate attribution, so you can relate anthropogenic climate forcing to the climate system. And then you have two different words, the words with higher temperature caused by anthropogenic climate change versus the word with the counterfactual word with lower temperatures. And you can input those different climate words into an impact model and see the difference for example, still keeping the temperature example, the difference in number of dead people related to a heat wave when you have the temperature that's affected by climate change compared to not affected by climate change. So it's very linear, so that you have anthropogenic forcings that will have an impact on the climate system, that will have an impact on the impacts. And here you have a list of examples of that. So what's interesting here to me is that anthropogenic forcing can also have some influence on the impacts themselves. And that's why I think we can broaden we can broaden attribution to include more anthropogenic forcings. And here you have another example that I find interesting. It's from Smiley et al. 2022, and it's about the Harvey hurricane in Texas. And they have an hydrologic model that gives them the number of houses that are flooded for different hexagons that you have here. And what this shows is the additional flooding caused by climate change. So some houses would have been flooded without climate change, and some houses were flooded only because the signal on precipitation was a bit higher because of climate change. And so here you can see that in some places you have higher number of buildings that have been flooded because of climate change. And what they also did there is to look at, you have three types of houses: the houses that were not flooded, the houses that were flooded and would have been flooded without climate change, and the houses that have been flooded only because of climate change. And they looked at the difference in racial and ethnic groups for the different types of buildings. And that's a way to understand what would be called environmental inequalities. There's some climate injustice happening there, so that some population are most at risk to get their houses flooded because of climate change compared to others. So I think it's important to remember that, I think you're all aware, but to remember that extreme weather events and hazards don't necessarily mean extreme impact. So here you have a theoretical distribution of extreme weather, where you have extreme weather events, and a theoretical distribution of impacts. And you can see that in this theoretical distribution, the extreme weather events don't necessarily all lead to impacts. And if you look at the extreme impacts events in this extreme impact distribution, not all of them are necessarily caused by extreme weather events. So I think when we do this type of analysis, it tends to forget this difference between extreme weather events and extreme impact events. And there's been some, and one of the reasons why the framing matters is that since the 70s, the geographers and the people working in risk management have been very vocal about taking the naturalness out of natural disasters, meaning that when a natural disaster happens, it's caused not only by the hazards, but also by vulnerability and exposure. And a lot of the discourses regarding natural disasters tend to take out the responsibilities of the local managers who have not been working on ensuring that the people living in those places that are affected by natural disasters are not vulnerable to them. And so you have those two papers are very famous ones. And more recently, some social scientists have been looking at extreme event attribution as a way to highlight the role of the hazard in those disasters, and potentially hiding a bit of of vulnerability and exposure by putting back the highlight on the hazards more than on the rest of the other causal factors of risks. So this is a quote from a paper by Lasson et al. That's on specific cases in Brazil, where they say that putting the blame on climate change when an extreme disaster happens could be a convenient means to escape blame for local disaster management. And I think that's important for us to realize that our results can be used this way. Sorry. Yeah. So here are other quotes from papers that I found interesting, and that I think it's also interesting to present them to the community of people doing attribution. So from a paper by Lasson and Ribot from 2022, describing climate and weather as the cause of disasters can be misleading, since disasters are caused by pre-existing fragilities and inequalities on the ground. Analytic frames that attribute disaster to climate can divert attention from these place-based vulnerabilities and their social-political causes. And there are also examples from another paper about two floods in Brazil from 2008 and 2011. So I think it's important here to say that back then, attribution studies weren't as prominent that they are now when those two events happened. And also that the signal of climate change itself wasn't as clear-cut than it is now and that it will be in the coming years. And so I think the situation, both in terms of weather, but also in terms of our own narratives that we put into the that we put forward, for example, in media, has changed since then. And in those cases, the people who have been talking about climate change as a potential as a potential cause for those two floods are not scientists; they're more politicians, both local politicians and also people like Al Gore. So those quotes that I will read are, "We find that a variety of contextual factors compel environmental leaders and scientists in Brazil to avoid and discourage highlighting the role of climate change in national extreme events. And attributing such events to climate change, and by extension, attribution science, can be ineffective for policy action on climate change and other socio-environmental issues in need of public pressure and preventive action." So because of this context, with some colleagues, we have been thinking of proposing another framework that would be more mindful of exposure and vulnerability. And this can read as here. You can see the figure here. And anthropogenic activity can have influence both on hydroclimatic drivers. And hydroclimatic drivers would typically be those weather meteorological variables such as precipitation, wind, or temperature. And they can be affected both by sources of variability, but also by anthropogenic activities through greenhouse gases and aerosols. And those hydroclimatic drivers will have an influence on what we call stressors here. And stressors would be, for example, soil moisture, which is not only a weather-related variable, and or it can be for flood, a water level. And those stressors are also influenced by exposure and vulnerability, and exposure and vulnerability can be affected by anthropogenic activity too, through adaptation policies. And then from those stressors, you can derive impacts. And in the discussion we've had with my co-authors, since we were from different disciplines, we realized that what we call impacts can vary a lot from one community to another and be closer to socioeconomic impacts or closer to the physical world. And so I think that's a point to be mindful of. Yeah. And to give an example, you can, like, these kinds of graphs you can do just qualitatively first. So here you have an example of the Portugal fire from 2017. And one of the co-authors of my paper was Alex Ramos. And so they wrote a very interesting paper on this Portugal fire that's using the storylines approach. And here you can see that an example where you have anthropogenic activity that can influence hydroclimatic drivers. Here the hydroclimatic drivers would be heat waves, long-term precipitation deficits, extreme fire weather, or extreme winds. And they are also affected by a source of variability that's hurricane Ophelia. The influence of anthropogenic activity on the hurricane can also be evaluated. And those different hydroclimatic drivers can have influence on the stressors, and the stressors here will be low soil moisture and the mega fires. And that can lead to impacts that are burned area, biomass loss, poor air quality, mortality, infrastructure, economic losses. And the anthropogenic activity can also have influences on exposure and vulnerability, such as extreme vegetation stress, vegetation composition, high fuel load, fire season definition, warning system evacuation failure, elder rural population, agricultural abandonment, and that can also have an influence on the stressors and the impacts. And then anthropogenic activity can also have an influence here directly on the stressors through extremely high ignition number, and through on the impacts and on the stressors through fire brigade intervention and first aid that are typically more rapid anthropogenic activities than the ones that are related to exposure and vulnerability. And it's possible also to think of a quantitative framework. And what you need here is to have an impact that's a function of hazard, vulnerability, and/or exposure, and that will give you an impact. And you also need to build pertinent counterfactuals. So counterfactuals where you have a word with less climate change, well, without climate change, and you can test different types of adaptation measures or yeah, I will give you a concrete example. Here, it's also a paper about Hurricane Harvey that was published in 2019 by Sebastian et al. And their goal is to attribute the flooding to both climate change and urbanization. So they have an hydrological model, and they have different, and they run their model in different conditions. So you have the factual worlds, that's the current conditions, where you have the 2017 development and harvest rainfall. Development here is urban development. And then you have three counterfactuals. The one that we're used to, which would be the baseline plus development. So you have still the same urban development, and you have the harvest rainfall decreased by 15%. And so the decrease by 15% would be considered to be the climate change effect. Then you have a counterfactual where you have the same level of climate change as in 2017, plus the 1900 development, urban development. And then you have a baseline where you have both the counterfactual words in terms of climate change and counterfactual words in terms of urban development. And what they find here is that here you have three different variables with a percent increase in discharge, volume, and difference in house to peak discharge. And if we look at this one, for example, you have the influence of they're looking at for each station. So yeah, they have different water gauges in their hydrological models. So each pond would be one station. And at each station, they compare their counterfactual they compare the counterfactual with the current conditions. So it's the current conditions minus one of the counterfactuals. And you can see how much of an increase you have that's related to climate change, related to development, and related to both. And what's interesting here is that you can see that the urban development is much more, explains a lot more of the increase in discharge than climate change, although they are both a factor of increase in discharge. But if you look at the numbers, this is not like additional. So here you have approximately 20% increase in discharge. Here you have approximately 50% increase in discharge, and here you have 80%. So it means that when you have the urban development, the effect of climate change is even bigger than it would be if you had no urban development. And that's an interesting result that they find. I'm not sure, maybe I'm being a bit no, it's 2:20, so I still have time. Yeah. So another thing that I find interesting in this paper is that you can also look at the changes, the percent changes in your discharge at local water gauges, and what happens because of climate change, what happens because of development, and what happens due to the combination of both. And here they look at what's happening without reservoirs, because in this region they have built reservoirs to counter some of the impacts of hurricanes and storms and to protect some local populations. So those reservoirs are here. And you can see that in the local stations that are close to the reservoirs, there's an impact of the reservoirs, but it's not going to cover the full region for either of the, just looking at climate change, just looking at development, or looking at the full current conditions. And that's another interesting result, I think, to see that the reservoirs can be useful, but only on a very local scale. And here I feel like with this kind of attribution studies, you can tell a lot more about adaptation strategies and about what is the role of the anthropogenic forcings individually and combined. And I think that's something that we could do a lot more in attribution studies and is not done that much yet. And it can answer some of the criticism from the colleagues in social science. So what I think and what we have been saying in this paper is that this framework that we are proposing could help define better how mitigation and adaptation interact, and it could help to point out boundaries where adaptation is not enough. So here, in this example, urban development has led to more impacts, but another thing that could be done is to look at potential adaptation strategies that could be where here both signals go in the same sense of having more risks, but you could have a counterfactual where you have some adaptation strategies that decrease the risk. And we could also look in the future for different levels of climate change and anthropogenic forcing on greenhouse gases, how much, at which point those adaptation strategies don't work anymore. And it could help to highlight maladaptation. And I think that's something that could be said, for example, here, that this kind of urban development could count as maladaptation. And I have a question for all of you, because this kind of work is also motivated by trying to understand better what attribution can bring to the table when we discuss climate change. How can we make it useful, not only within climate science, but outside of it? And can we use it to help politicians come up with better solutions? Can we use it to highlight better the risks of climate change? And I think a lot of the motivation behind extreme event attribution is to be useful to society and also to find our role, to define better our role as climate scientists in terms of communicating the level of the crisis and showing how important it is for non-scientists to act. And I wonder, in the current geopolitical context, how we can evaluate the impact of scientific communication. And that's really an open question. I don't really have an answer to this, but I feel like it's something we might want to discuss. And with this, I am finished with this presentation. I hope it was clear and not too repetitive for the people who have already seen it. and I'm open for both questions and comments and discussions.
Thank you, Aglaé. Please raise your hand and discuss with everybody. Does anyone has already a question?
And if there is not problem, I'm not sure if there's any question in the chat. I took away the Zoom window.
No, there is not at this point.
Okay.
But please, we still have time for a couple of questions and or discussion or remark, unless you want to add something, Aglaé, or maybe, I don't know.
I'm good, but if like nobody has questions, it's also fine to stop here, and like I'm always happy to discuss those things whenever we meet live. So yeah.
Okay, well, unless someone raises a hand at the last minute, we can wrap up here.